Good afternoon from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clement Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute. We're all in shock here at the Nanovic Institute by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our institute has a long-term partnership with the Ukrainian Catholic University, and the senior vice-rector of UKU is with us as a visiting scholar for the semester and is joining us for the panel. Our university president, Father Jenkins, has issued a statement this morning where he said, "The former oppressors of Ukraine are now known by another name and are waging war on a different flag. But the trauma is no less today than in the past in this nation that has suffered far too much. Now, more than ever, our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide in demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign nation. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." The dean of the Keough School, Scott Appleby, has released a statement just a few minutes ago, where he says that the academic community of the Keough School of Global Affairs condemns Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. The invasion is criminal. It violates international law, as well as those moral standards that shape the possibility of peace. The political order of Europe, and indeed of the world, is at stake. The Ukrainian Catholic University has issued a statement. Today, Russia has started bombing and shelling Ukraine. This war has been going on for the last 8 years. But today, Ukraine and the whole world face the greatest danger since 2014. We call on all our partners abroad to be alert. This war is not just the war of Russia with Ukraine. The Kremlin's regime is ruining the fundamentals of international order. We try to find a language for what's happening, and we try to understand what the implications of the invasion could be, and most importantly, what is required from all of us in this situation. What does solidarity mean in this situation? I'm very grateful to our 5 panelists for being available at such short notice for our emergency flash panel. I will briefly introduce them in the order of speaking. Taras Dobko is Senior Vice-Rector of Ukrainian Catholic University, Lviv, Ukraine, and a visiting scholar in the Nanovic Institute for the spring semester. Thank you so much, Taras, for being with us. Ian Johnson is Paige Moran Family Assistant Professor of Military History and Historian of War, Diplomacy and Technology. He's a faculty fellow of the Nanovic Institute. Thank you, Ian, for being with us. Emilia Justyna Powell is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Concurrent Associate Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame and also a fellow at the Nanovic Institute. Emilia, thank you so much for joining us. Rüdiger Bachmann is Stepan Family College Professor of Economics and a faculty fellow of the Nanovic Institute. Thank you so much, Rudy, for bringing an economic perspective. Jim McAdams is the William M. Scholl Professor of International Affairs. He was director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies for 16 years and has founded the Catholic Universities Partnership that forged the strong bonds with the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. Thank you, Jim, for joining us and welcome. I've asked each of our 5 panelists to offer a brief initial thoughts for up to 5 minutes, and then we can try to enter into a dialogue. We will end on time after 1 hour since we want to respect your busy schedules, and Taras has many other things to do, as you can imagine. So again, welcome all, and please, dear Taras, if I could give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate very much the statement by Father Jenkins and other people at Notre Dame. I appreciate your support, Clemens, and of the Nanovic team, which is very much needed in this situation. Of course, to say that I am, shocked is really to say nothing. So I am very much worried about what is happening right now in my country. And but some facts speak for themselves. They are clear, so that that Putin has chosen the path of bloodshed, of inflicting suffering and destroying human lives, and this kind of aggression, which he calls military operation, but which is large-scale invasion, which is conducted on different places around the border of Ukraine, is really completely unjustified aggression and affair. And I hope that the time will come when Putin and those who are in charge of this violation of any possible international and human laws and norms will be brought to justice and will be brought to court as war criminals. I think so. The situation is very tense in Ukraine. Of course, it is very important to stay calm because there is much also disinformation going on. There are some. So Ukrainian armed forces do resist. There are some difficult situations, especially in the south, where they try to attack from Crimea to Kherson Oblast, Kherson region, and also of the big city of Sumy. And many people already use shelters, bomb shelters, usually underground, communications to use to protect their lives. But also the most recent development is that it seems that Putin would like to do some kind of military operation to overturn the Ukrainian government in Kyiv. So they seized already an airport which is like 10 kilometers away from Kyiv, and there could be special forces coming there, with the intention, perhaps, to to install in Kyiv the puppet regime. But I just don't see and don't buy that Ukrainians could acknowledge any kind of regime which will be installed in such a brutal way in such circumstances. So in any case, if to go from zooming out to more zooming in, our university is located in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, which is still comparatively safe place. But of course, everybody is worried. We already are receiving, including in the university itself, some refugees coming from eastern and central Ukraine, fleeing before the military aggression of Russia. I must say that also there are queues of people who are donating their blood, and even there was an appeal not to do it anymore because these blood stations couldn't really manage all the people willing to help, and a lot of people are also signed for the territorial defense units in case Russian troops will go in Western Ukraine. Usually, for the moment, it seems that really the scenario, the plan is, to hit and suppress military forces, especially aircraft and different airports in Ukraine with missiles, and to try to do some special operation for dismantling the Ukrainian government. But what I can say, what we can do in Ukraine is really to resist and fight. So this is what is kind of main contribution from my country, from my people. But we expect very much that we will be supported and helped by severe and devastating response from the West with sanctions and other possible resources in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Taras, so much. Yeah, we'll come back to the question of disinformation, whom can we trust and what's happening on the ground. Ian, please, maybe a historical perspective or whatever you want to contribute.
Thank you, Clemens. It's great to join this panel in a tragic and an alarming moment to discuss ongoing events and the potential consequences. I thought I'd offer just a few thoughts, some historical context, and maybe some evidence that suggests at least a little what might happen in the next days and weeks. So in many senses, I would suggest that Putin's invasion is really the culmination of a series of history wars over essentially the status of Russia's sovereign neighbors that really began in the aftermath of the Cold War. Putin has long challenged the right of states neighboring Russia to be fully sovereign because, in part, of a variety of historical claims that he's repeatedly made. On February 21st, when he acknowledged the breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as sovereign, he delivered a highly revisionist historical account of Russia and its relationship to its near abroad, particularly Ukraine. Among those claims was one that Lenin was the author and architect of modern Ukraine, and that Ukraine's attempt to decommunize Ukrainian history really meant that it was unraveling its own sovereignty. And he repeatedly stated something that's become a favorite trope of his, that this was confirmed by archive documents, as if that gave some of his historical claims greater credibility. What he was talking about was Korenizatsiya, a brief-lived and ultimately abandoned Soviet policy of promoting Ukrainian language and other aspects of Ukrainian national identity that Stalin rapidly abandoned in the 1930s, something he neglected to mention in his remarks. In justifying the military occupation initially of those territories in eastern Ukraine, he was essentially relying on his own version of historical record, combining some real scholarship with obvious myths and fictions. In a second speech, which he delivered last night, so early morning Moscow time, which was pre-recorded and interestingly seems to have been played after Russian special operations units had already crossed the border and only moments before the first missiles began landing in Ukraine, he again laid out a different historical perspective. He reiterated specifically Russian historical grievances, particularly restating multiple times in the speech his view of history since the end of the Cold War. In that speech, he blamed the United States and NATO for violating a variety of treaties as well as international law, and suggested that any American critique of his moves in Ukraine was hypocritical at best and concealing thinly veiled power politics at worst. He suggested that NATO expansion and Ukraine's government genocide, the term he's used repeatedly in recent days, of those who rely on Russia in a vague sense of the term, meant that Russia had no other option left to protect Russia and its people, but in his words, the one that we will be forced to use today. Now, I would suggest that these two speeches taken together and the historical understanding that Putin has outlined suggests both his justifications and perhaps give us some sense of his ultimate aims. Very clear in this speech, in both speeches, is the fact that obviously his aim is to halt NATO expansion, even a rollback of the alliance perhaps. But in addition, he has suggested that his aim was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, again, hearkening back to the Second World War, a frequent trope in his recent speeches as well. Now, what that would actually entail, one has to assume, although he said that Russia would not be occupying much of the country, those aims, demilitarization, denazification, obviously required an extended military presence, presumably meaning occupation. His grounds, again, are old historical ones, that Ukraine is an invented nation, invented by Russia, and that fundamentally they are part of a broader Russian nation, that any attempt to separate the two would create a security crisis for Russia. And of course, this flies in the face of modern international law, as well as any nuanced understanding of history. I would note that twice in the course of the 20th century, Ukraine resisted and at great cost, though ultimately succumbing eventually to Soviet power, domination by Russia. In the course of the Polish Bolshevik War, at the beginnings or during the Russian Civil War, and then during and after the Second World War, a very contentious period of history. It took Soviet forces after the Second World War 11 years to subdue insurgencies against Soviet power, a process that only ended after the deaths of over 30,000 Soviet troops and about 130,000 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as hundreds of thousands more who were deported. An incredibly tragic page in Ukraine's history, and one that we can only pray will not be repeated in recent or in coming days. What I would note in addition, just from a military history perspective, if we look at the technology and capabilities of the adversaries or of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces, things have changed somewhat since 2014. And I think this is also important in understanding what the path forward may look like. In 2014, the Ukrainian military was clearly not prepared to grapple in any way, shape, or form with Russian forces. But the United States and NATO partners have supplied more than $2.5 billion in military equipment, have operated training facilities on Ukrainian territory, have assisted in a variety of ways in updating command and control and communications, and as well as intelligence and surveillance technology. Now, these areas that have been most improved are particularly in with infantry-based weapon systems, which may suggest very, very tragically that we'll see quite intensive ground combat, especially in major urban areas as the Russian advance proceeds. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you so much, Ian. Also for giving us these two reference points, a nuanced understanding of history and international law, as well as a rather bleak outlook given your assessment of the situation. Thank you. Emilia, please, a political science perspective. Thank you.
So I will give political science as well as international law perspective. And interestingly, I just visited Poland literally 2 days ago. So I have a lot of perspective from a neighboring country who is right now scrambling in preparation to receive quite a few Ukrainian refugees. So on 24th of August, 1991, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic changed its name to Ukraine. That means that according to international law, Ukraine has met all of the requirements set by international law to become an independent state. And international law is clear on the topic that the requirements are territory, population, government, and capacity to enter into relation with other states. The international community has agreed that Ukraine has met all of those requirements and it's thus a sovereign state. First of all, what Putin has done, Russia, before the invasion even, Russia recognized two parts of Eastern Ukraine as sovereign states. And when I say recognize, I should say recognize. Why is it? Because this recognition obviously also violated critically international law. And I refer here to the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. This was already a clear violation of international law. Furthermore, what has happened today is a clear full-scale invasion on Ukraine, because what we have is the crossing of an internationally recognized border of a sovereign state, that of Ukraine, and that crossing is taking place with military force. We have an assault on peace and security, not only of Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereignty, but also peace and security of international community. But I think we need to ask ourselves a question: are we actually surprised that that happened? As previous speakers have mentioned, it's really important to look at the speeches by President Putin into what he claims are legitimate moves into reclaiming territory that's somehow originally Russian. So from the speeches, I want to elaborate a little bit how sometimes politics, especially power politics, is leveraged against the reality and clear statements of international law. So Mr. Putin has really expressed hardline nationalism, and I would say paranoia towards the West. He, of course, presented fabricated and distorted history. He has even called Ukraine earlier as not even a state. So whereas international law is clear that Ukraine is a sovereign state, Putin is advancing rhetoric to put this reality into question. Putin decided that Ukraine was actually manipulated into declaring independence from Russia. And he has gone so far as saying that Ukraine is outright exterminating and suppressing Ukrainian Russian-speaking population, that Ukrainian government is supporting Islamic radical organizations, kidnapping Russian citizens, and forging terrorist attacks. So really, when we contrast this political rhetoric with the reality of international law, we see clearly that there is this dichotomy that cannot be reconciled. What is really worrisome to me is that some of the phrases that Mr. Putin has used in recent days are really threatening beyond to what we're seeing right now. For instance, Putin has reminded the world that Russia is remaining the most powerful nuclear state with cutting-edge nuclear weapons. This is rhetoric that's really uncalled for and entirely threatening. I want to highlight one last thing here. Prior to 1991, Ukraine was, of course, part of the Soviet Union and had Soviet nuclear weapons on its territory. Later, they were formally controlled by the Commonwealth of Independent States. However, in 1994, Ukraine agreed to destroy these weapons and to join the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. And at the same time, in the Budapest Memorandum, US, UK, and Russia stated that they would guarantee Ukrainian security. So we see here that Russia's actions clearly violate international law, not only basic international law, but also Russia's own treaty commitments, just a clear violation of international law.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emilia, for this clear analysis of that's a invasion in the full sense of the term and a clear violation of international law. Let's move the perspective from economics. Professor Bachmann, Rudi, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Clemens, for having me. I want to split my remarks between what I think we can already confidently know and predict, and then to the much bigger part where I think we have a lot of uncertainties. So I think what already has happened and will continue to happen is gas and energy prices will go up, and stock markets will tank. I mean, we saw the Russian stock market tank, the ruble tank. So there will be also economic suffering in Russia itself, which will play a role for how long Putin can keep this up. But anyway, we have seen the oil prices spike. We've seen gas prices go up. They'll probably continue to go up. I think this is particularly devastating for Europe. I mean, they do have gas reserves that will last until the summer, and the winter hasn't been too bad apparently in Europe. So they have more reserve than they thought they would. But Europe will have to switch to something quickly, at least before the next winter. For the United States, this is partly bad for the United States consumer, but given that the United States is a producer themselves of some of these energy, this could actually be economically somewhat beneficial. So I think that's the very immediate reaction. The other thing we know, I think, is that at least in Europe, but potentially in the United States, we will have to see, I guess, a massive increase in military spending. The Europeans finally have to get their act together And that means reduced consumption possibilities for the European consumer and potentially also for the US consumer. And that is on top to the already ongoing climate transformation. So there's a lot of economic activity devoted to investment activity, both on the climate change front that's going on anywhere, which is of course complicated, let's not forget that, by gas prices going up and stuff like that, given that in Germany, for example, natural gas was supposed to be the transition technology that gets us from a carbon economy to a carbon-free economy. That might be out of the window. It's unclear how the Germans will react, by the way. So, and on top of that, we'll have to invest considerable economic activity in military spending, and that is just not available. It's not going to be available for, you know, things that we rather like to have, namely consumption activity. And the third point, I think, and here I'm putting on my game theorist hat, surprised none of the political scientists has mentioned this. The third point that to me is inevitable is I see bleak years ahead in terms of nuclear proliferation. Because what has happened here is the Ukrainians believed, the West, that, you know, if you denuclearize and you become, you know, you follow the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons, you will be promised your national security. And if I were any state in the world right now at this point, and I don't have nuclear weapons, the first thing you have to get is nuclear weapons right now. So we will see a massive increase of that activity, and that cannot be good for world peace. For world peace and world security. So those are the things I think we can already predict. I would bet money on that, on those things. The other things. Now let's get to the uncertainties. What does it mean? So in the short run, I can see sort of, we have been talking a lot about inflation, obviously, in the United States. A gas price hike is not going to help that. On the other hand, if it's so bad, and that will depend on how long, you know, that whole war will last, you know, what uncertainties it will create. If it creates a recession, we could find ourselves, you know, if this is going on for years, say, we could find ourselves in a worldwide recession, in which case inflation is the least of our problems. But that I don't know which way that will go. We have seen the stock market tank. If the US consumer reacts to that, we might well find ourselves in more of a recessionary time period. And then there are these things, you know, that where the uncertainties are, but again, how long is it going to be? How severe it is going to be, and what will be the ramifications? This morning, I saw an interview with Senator Warner from the Senate Intelligence Committee, who has warned of a massive cyber war between. So I don't think anyone is actually talking about sort of a conventional hot war between the US and Russia. I hope that's still absolutely off the table. But what doesn't seem to be off the table is a cyber war, which could be, we don't know, this could have catastrophic consequences for the United States economy. So that's one thing. For Europe, I believe Ian mentioned it, is a refugee problem. What is going to happen there? Are we going to have a massive refugee problem that Europe will have to deal with? That's going to not only have economic consequences, but of course a lot of human suffering. I suppose in the medium run, if they went to Germany, where they actually need people, young people, to build new climate-friendly houses, this could actually help. But I don't want to be that cynical. I hope this is not going to happen. But anyway, that's sort of completely up in the air with massive economic consequences. And then the question is, I think a big chunk that we still don't know, and Joe Biden is supposedly speaking right now, so afterwards we'll know a little more. How severe are these sanctions going to be? Are we going to cut off Russia completely from the international commerce? And can we even do that? That's the other big question I have, and I don't know the answer is, namely, what about China here? Okay, what is China going to do? The news and the statements from the Chinese are not encouraging. Last week, I thought, the Chinese would rather have, would told Putin not to do it, because it's bad for business. War is bad for business. Whether they did that, I don't know, but apparently for sure they weren't heard. But this morning they basically started blaming the US as a causal agent, as the aggressor here. Completely absurd, of course. But anyway, so how is China going to react? Is China going to be, I don't think we can cut off both Russia and China from the world economy. And if we did that, we would be massively poorer. Maybe we'll have to, but I don't know. So if we cut Russia off from the world economy, SWIFT from the international payment system, will they just use China as a back channel to keep the de facto connection to the US economy? I don't know. I really don't know. But those are the big questions we need answers to. And that will be a function of the sanctions. So there is unfortunately, economics is a dismal, it's called the dismal science, and I have dismal news. The tougher the sanctions are going to be, the harder they're going to be, the more economic suffering there will be in Russia, but certainly also in our own countries. And I don't know how much economic suffering we'll tolerate.
Thank you, Rudy.
I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for the three certainties about the rising gas and energy prices, the military spending, and the nuclear proliferation, and then the open questions about refugees, cyber war, China, and the ramifications for the economy. Jim, Professor McAdams, please, a perspective from an expert on Eastern Europe. Thank you, Jim.
So what we've heard is fairly grim, and I'm unfortunately going to be a little bit more grim because this is an unfathomable circumstance. Some of us were talking with our friends in Lviv, Ukraine this morning, and no one here could have imagined even a couple of months ago that something like this would transpire. My concern now is that we may be looking at a future in which much worse things could happen. And therefore, we in the United States need to be very aware of what is at stake and what is happening in Ukraine. It's so easy for Americans to think that Ukraine is a country a long way away. Most Americans couldn't even find it on the map. Television pundits and politicians tend to dismiss it. Oh, it's not part of NATO. It's not even in the European Union. But Ukraine's destiny is linked directly with our destiny. And we've already heard in all these presentations that Ukraine is Europe. It is historically Europe. It is culturally Europe. It is economically part of Europe, and it is legally Europe. And so when one stands back and looks at the big picture, when Americans look at the big picture of our security interests, we need to be very concerned about the fact that we may be seeing a steadily escalating crisis with Russia. Putin has made very clear that he intends to restore the lost territories of the former Soviet Union, regain Russia's greatness, correct the injustices, the supposed injustices of the past. This military invasion is not the only time that he has invaded a sovereign country. Indeed, he has been involved in, Russian troops have been involved in the invasion of Ukraine for quite some time now. And my concern is that in the coming months, we could see ramifications of Putin's position and what he has already done that will directly affect all of Europe and us as well. And I'll point to just two flashpoints that we should be concentrating on. One is in the former Yugoslavia, in the northern half of the Republic of Bosnia, the Republic of what is called the Republic of Srpska, which is a largely Serb-dominated republic that was created as a part of the Dayton Accords to solve the fighting, the wars, the genocides in post-Yugoslavia. I think we could see the Republic of Srpska precipitate military action against its neighbors in the southern half of Bosnia, or even Croatia. And Croatia is a member of NATO. More frightening, and something that would directly affect our interests immediately, would involve any of Putin's designs on the Baltic states. And for those out there who think that somehow none of this matters, all that you need to do is to look at a map and to see that there is a Russian territory, a part of Russia, Kaliningrad, that is cut off from Russian territory by NATO members, Lithuania and Poland. Kaliningrad is the center of the Russian Baltic Fleet. It's the only warm water port that Russia has. And it is separated from Russia, or at least from Russia's ally, Belarus, by a tiny piece of land. It's a narrow valley of about 60 miles that happened to run across the borders of Lithuania and Poland. Should Putin at this point be emboldened in any way to instigate any further measures, particularly military measures, either direct or indirect, we have every reason to fear that we will see the kind of conflict that spirals into a serious international war.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, for this strong statement. Ukraine is Europe, and your analysis of the real risk of a steadily escalating crisis with Russia. We have 20 minutes for Q&A. Many questions have already come in, so we have to be very selective, and I apologize to all of those to whose questions we cannot get. A question for political scientists, maybe let's ask Emilia about that. And the question is about the Security Council membership. Can this invasion of Ukraine lead to Russia being kicked off the UN Security Council?
This is a very interesting question that one has to answer with a guess, because at this point, when we're judging and evaluating everything that has happened really in the last 4 days, I don't know that we actually foresaw that that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at what the European leaders thought was going to happen, it's not what actually happened. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if I'm being asked a question, what's going to happen in the future in this context, I do not have the knowledge or capacity to answer that question, because this decision would further anger Russia and would not, I think the response is going to lean towards imposing more of economical sanction, because that's going to actually hurt Russia more versus just angering it.
Thank you, Emilia. I'm afraid I have to ask you for a brief question, brief answers, as hard as this may be. I think a question for Rudy. Is the threat of cutting Russia from SWIFT credible? And in case it happens, how likely is it to affect the Russian economy?
again, I think this depends a lot on the reaction of China. I mean, it would be catastrophic for Russia, but it would also hurt, especially Europeans. I mean, then a lot of European creditors would have to write down their assets, and this could lead to financial meltdowns, which of course governments would have to step in. But this could, at the very least, it could lead to a lot of tumult. But again, I think it only stands to, if we do this, it only is really effective if Russia doesn't find a back door through China.
Thank you. A question which I may direct to Ian, if I may. Now the US attention and many resources are devoted to Ukraine. What are the odds that other nations will take advantage of these situations? For example, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or the war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, or a war between Israel and Iran?
It's a very scary prospect. And we saw that Taiwan issued a national alert. 9 Chinese aircraft violated Taiwanese airspace this morning. This is on the heels of about 6 months of increased Chinese aerial activity in Taiwanese airspace. So absolutely, if there's a sense that the international order is unraveling to some degree and that military interventions are not likely, these sorts of acts of aggression seem much more likely.
Thank you, Ian. Maybe a question that I can pose to Taras. It's a question about the church. What are the obligations, if any, of the Pope, the Ukrainian Patriarch, and the Russian Patriarch?
It's a great question. I will start, from the last one, from the Russian Patriarch. So the only, statement we have heard from him, from Kirill, was yesterday when he was blessing. So Russia celebrated a day of Russian soldier, and somehow he was appealing to the soldiers, to their glory, to their obligation to defend Russia. And this was the only kind of statement which we could take only as an encouragement for war. I must say, finally, the situation make kind of forced to wake up Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, because they issued finally a statement really condemning this military aggression, because they were always looking for euphemism, to avoid who is a perpetrator and who really puts a threat to Ukraine. The head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Patriarch Sviatoslav Shevchuk, spoke about the obligation to defend, the country and defend the peace and dignity of people. And I know that the Pope expressed today some regret, but I don't know, details about more details about the statement from the Vatican. So I think, we as Ukrainians expect more clarity from the Vatican about the whole situation. What else is needed to avoid euphemism? And of course, where the Holy See was clear, it was advocating for peace. And this is the main purpose of the church. And, putting all the situation in spiritual terms, that it's not about only a relationship on the institutional level of, international level of countries. It's about life of many, many people. Yeah.
Thank you, Taras. Let me ask you, Taras, has Archbishop Boris Kuciak made a statement already that you know of?
I didn't see. I didn't have time, to check. He is now currently in France, in Paris.
Okay. Thank you, Taras. A question for Jim McAdams, if I may. What is Europe really prepared to offer beyond sanctions that will slow down or stop Putin from taking all of Ukraine?
I don't know the answer to that question. What I would say is what Europe needs to offer is unity. And my concern is that that unity won't be there. One of my major concerns is Hungary, where Viktor Orban has shown a lot of enthusiasm for Putin.
Yeah.
I will also be watching Germany closely, because Germany has until recently shown a lot of ambivalence about the degree to which it wants to be involved in or support Ukraine. So beyond that, one can only hope that Europe stays together, and that somehow all of the tensions that exist within the alliance, one could also mention the EU here, are overcome to see this as a common threat.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Maybe a question that I could direct to Emilia, and then also Taras. And the question is, despite Putin's firm control of the security services, how long do you think the Russian elite will tolerate the loss of their billions and their travel privileges as the Russian markets and the ruble collapse?
So I'm going to briefly answer it. It's still the reality that many of the Russian magnates, if you will, are driving around in Bentleys and expensive Mercedes, and they're not feeling anything because the sanctions have not been targeted widely enough. And in my opinion, if that elite starts shaking economically, we may see some changes, because Putin is not ruling Russia by himself.
Okay. Rudy, do you share this estimate?
I agree that we haven't done anything yet. I'm hoping that this is what Joe Biden just announced. Again, he was supposed to speak as we speak. And I agree. We just haven't done anything yet. And we can do, leaving even the big question of SWIFT aside, I think we can do much more. We can freeze all these assets, give them no access or confiscate them. I would argue that probably we don't have many asset interests sitting in Russia. Their physical and financial assets are sitting in the West. And so we could easily confiscate them. I don't know easily, there are legal issues, but from an economic point of view, we can confiscate them, at least freeze them, and make these people really, really hurt. Yes. And I don't think we've done it.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. So we don't have much experience, because almost nothing was done in this respect. But I assume that these people are much more opportunistic than Putin, and much less, driven by ideological obsessions. So they will react if they will be hit.
Thank you. Jim McAdams talked a little bit about the Baltic states. There's an explicit question. I'm not sure whether Jim has already answered it. Maybe I can give it to Taras. The implications for the Baltic states. Will Putin disregard NATO and try to establish a land link to Kaliningrad? What's your assessment, Taras?
Somehow I hate to say it, but I think it's quite possible. Because if you Emilia was talking about it, and Jan was, analyzing Putin's recent speeches, and he was, very clear that, all countries that were created and became independent after the fall of the Soviet Union actually were created by distracting territories from historical Russia, which was at the time named the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So all these territories subtract, something from historical Russia. So you can imagine what it means in terms of, further steps. And also his speech, very much reminded me about Ukraine, what he was saying about Ukraine as a made-up artificial state, what actually Molotov, Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, said about Poland after, Poland was partitioned in 1939, that it is an ugly brainchild of Versailles Treaty. Mm-hmm. So it's very similar, analogous. And one more sentence, from his speech, the last speech when he announced the military invasion into Ukraine, that those who will intervene on behalf of Ukraine will experience all consequences that they have never experienced before. So it was a clear threat to, to any European countries, and I think for Baltic states, which were very supportive and are supportive of Ukraine militarily, this is a very risky situation.
Thank you.
And one
Clemens,
quick
Clemens,
response to that question.
Clemens,
Yes, Rudy. Sorry, Jim. Rudy.
Could we also hear the military historian on that? I would be very interested in Ian's
Yes,
response.
let us have Jim first and then Ian. Yes, thank you, Rudy. Jim, please.
Quickly, by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, we are obligated, as are all of the other member states of NATO, to come to the defense of any member that is attacked.
Thank you. And Ian, before you answer, there is another question connected to that. And the question is, the response from the EU, NATO and the US to Russia has been swift as compared to any other international crisis before. So now that Ukraine is not a full member of the NATO alliance, will the support from other states in terms of military support not counteract the norms and the security architecture? And how could a peaceful architecture in Europe for the security reasons look like in the future?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The crisis unfolded in some sense so slowly until last night. 3 months of almost every day being told that war was imminent, that it did provide opportunities to bring in additional supplies and formulate what a united response might look like. Obviously, the provision of military equipment to a state actively engaged in combat is a tricky one. Obviously, NATO's commitments are very, very limited. And you can imagine why, because the possibility of actually invoking Article 5 against Russia means World War III, potentially apocalyptic scenario. We've never had a great power war between nuclear states before. That's a very scary proposition. And I think to answer these questions about what action against NATO might look like, this Suwalki Gap, whatever it might be, I'd note that we'll probably see some tests of NATO resiliency and resolve in the coming days. Already, a Ukrainian aircraft flew into Romanian airspace. They scrambled fighters. There was a warning. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the next few days. There have been missile attacks within 50 miles of Poland's border. Something goes awry, and the Russians have been using some rocket artillery, essentially, that is not particularly accurate in certain areas from what we've seen on Twitter, at least so far. That's a very scary prospect. And what we'll see, I think, will likely determine Russia's response, the degree of unity in responding.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. And I mean, things change by the minute. I've received 2 messages during the panel. One says Russian forces have just taken control of Chernobyl. Another message, President Biden will speak soon, has not yet spoken. So what I would like to do at the very end is give each one of you one last final sentence, maybe 2, maximum 2, starting with Jim and ending with Taras, to give Taras the last word. Just one last sentence to close your panel. Jim, please.
I'm all for sanctions. I'm skeptical that they'll have much of an impact. I'm hopeful that there will be divisions within the Russian military or other elite circles.
Thank you, Jim. Rudy.
I'm just going to say what I wanted to say actually at the beginning. My thoughts are going to Taras and his family, if they are in Ukraine, his country, men and women. And it's just devastating. It's just unbelievably devastating news.
It is. Thank you, Rudy. Emilia.
I think one thing that Putin was right on is calling on precedents what has happened in the past by other powerful states. This is why it's so important to abide by international law.
Thank you, Emilia. Ian, please.
Well, I'd like to echo Rudy and also note that I think by launching what appears to be the first major war of territorial aggrandizement in Europe since 1939 and the outbreak of the Second World War, Putin is risking a great deal, including turning Russia into an international pariah for a generation to come.
Thank you, Ian. Taras, I want to give you the final word, and our solidarity is with you.
Yeah, Putin, of course, with all his power, could bring much destruction into Ukraine, and this is already happening. But I don't think there is any way to, subdue or suppress Ukrainians and make Ukrainians surrender to any, puppet government he would like to have in Ukraine.
And Taras, what would you like us to do here in Notre Dame as a community standing behind you and your university?
I think it's important really to spread the news, to support whoever in Ukraine. Just one sentence of support and solidarity, it makes much sense. And if possible, also to send statements to some other institutions, kind of calling them to speak on behalf of Ukraine.
Thank you, Taras. Thank you to the audience for watching our panel and for your questions. Thank you to our panelists for your expertise and also your solidarity. Thank you to our tech team, Grant, Kranya, and Chen, for making this happen at such short notice. Let me just end with two things. The UKU statement has this one paragraph, how can we all help? How can we all help? And it says, keep calm first, support Ukraine, help the Ukrainian army, and pray for the peace and victory of Ukraine. And let me end with reiterating our university president Jenkins' words. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them. Thank you so much. God bless, and let us keep in touch with each other.